Hello, everyone. Welcome to JINSA's timely webinar on U.S. nuclear talks with Iran and their implications for U.S. and Israeli policy, among many other considerations. I'm Jonathan Ruhe, JINSA Director of Foreign Policy. I'm pleased, as always, to be joined momentarily by retired IDF Major General Yaakov Amidror, who is a JINSA Distinguished Fellow and Israel's former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, and by John Hanna, who is the JINSA Randi and Charles Wax Senior Fellow and the former National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. A reminder to those who are joining us today in the audience, if you have questions throughout the course of today's webinar, please type them into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them in the time we have. I'm going to kick off today's webinar by taking a more active moderating role than usual, if only because there's a lot of, frankly, substantive material to try to quickly chew through in order to set the table for the discussion we're going to be having today, given the pace and intensity at which events have been moving recently. So to level set, I'll start by saying where the United States and Iran stand after 2 rounds of meetings over the last 2 weekends, and now with the 3rd round of supposedly technical talks set to begin by the end of this week. So slide 1, please. While that's getting set up, I'll start off by noting that before talks began, we saw strong statements from various Trump administration officials, including the president, about dismantling Iran's enrichment, weaponization, and missile programs, essentially the entirety of Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure. And we also heard President Trump issue a 60-day deadline for a deal. Now, the slide on your screen is showing, slide 1, please. This shows basically the initial statements, first from the president, where he basically said Iran, the goal of these talks is for Iran no longer to have a nuclear weapons program, to dismantle all the infrastructure verifiably and then remove it entirely. That was echoed by National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Trump's envoy for these talks, Steve Witkoff, before the talks began. As you'll see from this infographic, coming out of the first round of talks on April 12th, Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, hemmed and hawed on some of these initial statements and spoke of constraining and verifying Iran's nuclear program rather than outright eliminating it. We can take that slide off. Last week, there was also a major New York Times report that the Trump administration was seeking to forestall Israeli operational planning for a military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, at least while talks are ongoing. Combined, these developments have raised concerns that the U.S. is now sinking into a time-consuming and frankly open-ended process whereby Iran steadily tilts the negotiating table in its favor, and we merely end up with something like a redux of the original fatally flawed 2015 JCPOA. If we could go to slide 2, please. So as you'll see from this slide, Iran's nuclear program has expanded so monumentally in the last few years, especially under the failed round of JCPOA renewal talks under the Biden administration, that now you'll see in the red bar on this screen, this is how much more of Iran's nuclear infrastructure would need to be dismantled just to get back to the JCPOA's profoundly weak and limited restrictions on Iran's enrichment program. And mind you that in 2014 and 15, just to get those reductions you see in the various blue bars, that took months and even years of negotiations. And now, considering that the time frame for an acceptable deal that President Trump's articulated is that much shorter, there's also that much more to go. Again, this is not to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. This is just to get back to the very weak caps under the JCPOA. Slide 3, please. There's also the massive problem, even greater than under the JCPOA negotiations, that Iran has been progressively obscuring its nuclear progress from international inspectors, both on enrichment and weaponization. The head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, actually met with Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, last weekend, and we can only presume that he impressed on Witkoff that the IAEA has lost track of Iran's nuclear progress. This is something Grossi has been saying, frankly, for years, with increasing alarm as time has gone on, and Iran's program has progressed further, and the outside world has become more and more in the dark about this progress. Grossi has also said repeatedly that an entirely new agreement would need to be hashed out, even to meet the more limited demands just for a verifiable nuclear agreement. Again, this is something, this would have to be an entirely new deal. And even this would not meet the Trump administration's initial strong statements calling for dismantlement across the board, essentially the end of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Again, this reinforces the concern that we're headed toward time-consuming and rather intricate negotiating processes. Finally, slide 4, please. Iran has every reason to drag out these talks and to play up a lot of these factors and concerns that I just mentioned. Not least of its incentives is to run out the clock on what I'm sure everyone in this audience has heard about, which is the ability to snap back stringent UN and also European sanctions on Iran's nuclear enrichment program, its conventional weapons programs, drones, missiles, things like that, and also many of its core economic revenue generating sectors. This slide here is taken from a paper that was issued earlier this month by JINSA and authored by our Gamunder Center fellow Gabe Noronha. This here attempts to encapsulate that even though technically the snapback option does not expire until October 18th, procedurally, the window is already closing to initiate that process, ensure the highest likelihood of success, because we're going to need to work with our what are called our E3 partners, our European three, Britain, France, and Germany, to move this through the UN Security Council. And that would be most opportunistic now, as you can see in April, where France holds the UN Security Council presidency. The next best option, according to Gabe, would be May and June of this year, because it takes a month to vote on snapback and potentially 2 weeks to adjudicate any disputes that presumably UN Security Council permanent members, Russia or China, would initiate to try to gunk up the works and slow down this process further. Now, if Iran misses this opportunity for snapback altogether in one form or another before this deadline, Iran's nuclear program effectively becomes legitimated by the UN Security Council. The legal basis for all sanctions on Iran's nuclear program effectively vanish. Not to get too much in the weeds, but essentially what snapback would enable is the return to force of 5 legally binding UN Security Council resolutions from 2006 to 2010 that declared Iran in violation of its non-proliferation treaty obligations by the fact it had been enriching, by the fact it had been constructing secret facilities, and the fact that it had not been complying with the IAEA. So if there's no snapback, all of that goes away, vanishes forever, even though Iran has done absolutely nothing to come closer to compliance with those obligations. So for more information on this, I'd like to encourage everyone to go to jinsa.org and click on the Iran talks status link on the top right of our homepage. Now, in the course of delivering these remarks, I've been informed that General Amadror, there's a scheduling error or scheduling conflict, and he will not be able to join us for today's webinar, but that's okay. I'm very lucky to have John here to ask a lot of these questions too. And again, for our audience, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box and we'll address them in the webinar going forward. So John, I'd like to start with you, obviously, after having started with myself. So we saw in the first 2 rounds of talks between Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, and the Iranian foreign minister, first in Oman and last weekend in Rome. These were over and done in the course essentially of an afternoon each time, with at least a direct meeting very briefly between the 2 negotiators in the first meeting. So now that we're apparently heading into what we're calling technical talks rather than sort of high level diplomacy, to what extent, or what do you think sort of the U.S. sort of position or attitude is going forward now, given that, to use my own words and editorialize, in the first two rounds, they were basically negotiating about negotiating. To read the tea leaves, where do you think things might be going now if we are indeed headed to technical talks?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. First, we have to say it really is reading tea leaves. We haven't gotten a lot of information out of what exactly has been discussed in these two rounds of talks, or what exactly the subject of the so-called technical talks that experts are supposed to have sometime this week. We, of course, have the president and most of his administration for the first 90 days of this term coming out like gangbusters. Everything we could have wanted about their determination to end once and for all the Iranian nuclear weapons project, and taking a lot of steps to back up that demand through the creation both of renewed maximum economic pressure on the regime, which is really beginning to bite. By some accounts, Iran's oil exports, particularly to the Chinese, in the first 3 months of this year are down almost 2/3, costing Iran some $9 billion of potential revenue on top of an economy that was already, bordering on the brink of collapse. But in addition to maximum economic pressure, the president has taken an extraordinary number of steps to build up what had been lacking for the last several years in the American diplomatic toolkit, which is a really credible military threat. Just extraordinary actions build up nearly 1/3 of our fleet of strategic B-2 bombers that are capable of dropping the largest and most destructive bunker-busting bombs in the U.S. arsenal that would be capable of destroying those deeply buried underground Iranian enrichment sites, have been deployed now within reach of the Middle East on the island of Diego Garcia, together with all of the refueling tanker capability you would need to keep those planes in the air for a sustained attack on the Iranian nuclear program. You have now 2 U.S. aircraft carriers with all their firepower in the region. And I saw this morning that we've had more than 100 flights into the Middle East, transport massive U.S. military transport planes coming from both the continental United States as well as from the Asia Pacific, from bases in the Asia Pacific, delivering to nearly every country in the Middle East where the United States has got a substantial military presence near Iran. More than 100 flights that we assume are packed with primarily air defense equipment, and in the case of Israel, nearly 30 flights, probably more heavy munitions as well. So you've got to say that in terms of creating a credible military threat, the president has done exactly what you would want to do if you were going to undertake to destroy the Iranian nuclear program, both in terms of the offensive firepower to destroy those deeply buried sites, as well as defensive now to actually defend against any possible Iranian retaliation against Israel or some of our other friends and partners in the region. So all of that was excellent. And into that mix, however, in the last several weeks has come some very inconsistent and confusing statements, in particular by the president's lead negotiator, Mr. Witkoff, who both before the first round of negotiations and then afterward suddenly diverted from the position that the president and most of his other senior national security advisors, the position they'd articulated about we have to dismantle and eliminate Iran's capability to actually produce a nuclear weapon, which would mean dismantling and eliminating its ability to either enrich uranium or reprocess uranium, spent uranium. Mr. Witkoff has instead hinted that we, as you showed in your graphic, we'd be prepared maybe to allow some of that to exist for Iran to maintain some level of an enrichment program, and rather than, and that we would focus instead on establishing a verification regime that would ensure us they couldn't use that enrichment to actually make a dash at any future point toward a nuclear weapon. Those are two entirely different positions. One, which completely short circuit any Iranian ability to go for a bomb. The other, that is a verification regime, would leave in place an Iranian capability to, at some point in the future, perhaps after President Trump's second term, that they could make a dash or a pathway to a bomb after that. Mr. Witkoff has sort of reversed himself a couple of times. We don't know exactly what he said in the second round, but all we're left with is a degree of confusion. And I've got to say, some disquieting positive responses from the Iranians, from the Iranian foreign minister, and even from the Iranian supreme leader. And anytime the Iranians are happy about the way talks are going, are happy about what they call realistic American demands that don't cross any of their red lines. And their red lines are, of course, we are not going to surrender enrichment. We are not going to dismantle or give up our capability to have centrifuges spinning. And no one can touch our ballistic missile program or our ability to work with proxies in the region. When the Iranians are happy, I get very concerned. And so that mixture of some confusion introduced kind of at the last minute by the lead negotiator for the American president, combined with how positive the Iranians are sounding about the way forward, does make me, quite nervous and concerned about where we could be headed here, especially as you have said, given just how good and masterful the Iranians are at dragging out talks like this, defending their own red lines, exhausting the party across the table from them, which they've got a lot of experience with, and seeming to make concessions of a very temporary nature that could be easily reversed, and getting in exchange for that concessions from the United States and the West that are very hard to reverse, that are permanent in nature, particularly on the questions of massive economic sanctions to salvage this Iranian economy that really is right now on the brink of bankruptcy.
Thank you, John. And I would just to build off that, I would note we don't have it on the slide here, but it will certainly be available on the Iran Talks webpage on the JINSA website. Like comparing, we're talking about, we've mentioned the sort of the opening demands from the Trump administration, and how some of that may have been walked back, and then, as you mentioned, how Iran is talking about their positive reception of realistic U.S. demands, i.e., U.S. concessions. It's very interesting if you look at President Obama and his lead officials starting in late 2013, when concerted talks were getting going with the Iranians. There was a list of, here are the U.S. Red lines and ultimatums that would have to be baked in any deal should it come about, and that included Iran would have no right to enrich, no nuclear capable ballistic missiles anywhere, anytime, inspections, no heavy water reactors. Fordo would be their deepest buried current facility would be shuttered, things like that. And then in the course of 18 months, as Iran dragged out the talks, those were all eventually replaced by, as you mentioned, Supreme Leader Khamenei's red lines, where Iran essentially retains some version of each of those aspects of a program. So I guess to sort of build off that, as we saw with this New York Times story last week, sort of reporting that the Trump administration was trying to put the lid on potential Israeli military action, at least while talks were ongoing. We saw a lot about a debate between, I think they were called the restrainers versus the hawks within the administration. Those, basically saying that, if Israel strikes or if the United States gets involved in a war with Iran, it's effectively World War III. I would, and we've certainly seen a lot of this discussion come up both in official and sort of media discussions. John, I would love your thoughts on, what if, how obviously, World War III is a heavy benchmark to meet, but, would you be sanguine about the prospects for, if push comes to shove and there is military action against Iran's nuclear program, how obviously, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, but how might you see that playing out, and what words, if any, of sort of realism would you try to induce into this debate that maybe we're not seeing when the restrainers are saying that World War III is going to be the result?
Right. Well, I mean, of course, it is important to say that you have to obviously prepare for the worst if you're a U.S. military planner or responsible policymaker. Having said that, it's, the effort to conflate the kind of thing that is being planned for a military operation to destroy the Iranian nuclear program with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I just think is completely fallacious. It's false and it's incendiary, and I think it just confuses things. Nobody is talking about ground troops here, a ground invasion. And the fact is that obviously, in terms of where Iran is right now, having what Israel's done to Iran and its military conventional capability over the last year, in terms of utterly devastating most of its proxy forces in the region, that particularly Hezbollah and its missile arsenal that were supposed to be Iran's second strike capability in the event of an attack on the Iranian nuclear program. That is all gone. Israel, with U.S. and other coalition help, has twice now defended against the best that Iran could give in terms of missile, cruise missile, UAV salvos, some of the largest in the world. Didn't kill a single Israeli. So that we're capable of neutralizing. And of course, the Israeli strike on October the 26th of last year that took out all of Iran's strategic defenses, reduced its ability to produce additional solid fuel missiles that could hit Israel by some 93%, left Iran incredibly vulnerable to follow-on airstrikes. This is not to mention as well what we were talking about, just how crippled and bankrupt the Iranian economy is right now and how illegitimate that regime is in the eyes of its own people. I find it very hard to believe that Iran could sustain any kind of significant military campaign against U.S. and Israeli forces that are determined to counter it. I think that would be a suicide mission for the regime. In fact, there was New York Times reporting right before the initial rounds of negotiations asking why the supreme leader in Iran had actually, after months and months of saying, banning negotiations with the United States and the Trump administration specifically, calling them an idiotic and useless enterprise to negotiate at all. Why did the supreme leader suddenly on a dime agree to resume talks with the United States? And the reporting looked very solid, suggesting that a group of senior officials, national security officials, had come to the supreme leader with a special mission to convince him if Iran didn't talk or if negotiations were to begin and collapse, a U.S. or Israeli military strike and any follow-on strikes, if Iran attempted to retaliate, could well lead to the end of Islamic rule in Iran. That is, the regime itself would be very credibly at risk if Iran was to get into a war with the United States and Israel. And I think that threat is very real, more real than it's ever been. Nobody can count that the regime would collapse in the event of a military strike on its nuclear program. But I think that the risk in the mind of the regime is as high as it's ever been. And the one thing that we know the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guard value even more than their nuclear program is the survival of the Islamic Revolution itself. And I think that the Iranians know, and I hope President Trump understands, that it's the fate of the Iranian regime itself right now that, at least in the minds of the supreme leader, now hangs in the balance. And that is a leverage the likes of which an American president negotiating with the Iranians has never before seen. It's unprecedented leverage that we have right now over Iran to actually, and a historic opportunity through coercive diplomacy, if we're determined enough and strong enough and stick to our red lines about really ending Iran's ambition to become a nuclear weapon state. That opportunity right now has never been better for the United States to seize.
I think that's a sort of an incredibly important point. Even in the, the natural comparison here are the JCPOA talks under Obama and the JCPOA revival talks, for lack of a better term, under Biden. In both instances, we saw the United States approach the talks with, sort of pretty articulate, pretty explicit, avowals that there's always an alternative to diplomacy if Iran doesn't negotiate in a timely and good faith fashion. All options remain on the table. And then you saw once we entered talks, those military threats, especially the verbal aspect of them, sort of vanished. Even I think about a year into the Biden talks, you had his envoy for the talks go before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and say there is no military option, even though we also admit Iran is not engaging diplomatically in good faith. So, if this time, if there's sort of unprecedented leverage that the United States and Israel as well basically have in the background, you mentioned, the U.S. needs to stick by its deadlines and its demands, which is something that the United States has failed to do in the past. Is there anything more that you're still looking to see the United States, either by itself and or in coordination with partners, do to really hammer home for Iran that everything is on the table now if they don't negotiate, if they don't adhere to the deadlines the U.S. has demanded of them?
Yeah, it's hard for me to think of anything beyond a real clarity in the mind of the president and his lead negotiator, and hopefully what will be a really first-rate A-team of nuclear experts that surrounds his lead negotiator, on what their end state is. And I think they've got to be clear on that with the Iranians, and we'll know very quickly, I think, whether we can get a good deal or not, and a really clean deal that actually achieves what our core national interest is, which is to stop the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, a country that's out to destroy our best ally in the region, continues to chant death to America, is determined to become a regional hegemon, has been a threat to American national interest for more than 40 years. Our interest is that they cannot have a nuclear program that would in any way, shape, or form ever allow them to move toward a nuclear weapon. They simply cannot have that capability indigenously in their country. The good thing is that that's what's called the gold standard that we apply to every other normal, peaceful country in the world. You can have a civilian nuclear program to produce energy, but you cannot have the ability to enrich or reprocess that anything that would give you the capability at a time of your choosing to begin developing a nuclear weapon. That's the standard that the Obama administration, to our great disservice of our national interests, surrendered back in 2013 to the 2015 negotiation in the JCPOA, and it's haunted us ever since. And that's the real opportunity that President Trump has to go back now with the leverage that we do have, with this historic opportunity to actually once and for all end this crisis that we've been in for the last 20 to 25 years of Iran moving ever closer to becoming a nuclear weapon state, which would change the world in the most negative way possible for U.S. interests and the international order. For Iran now to join the rest of its axis of aggressors in Moscow, Beijing, and North Korea as a nuclear weapon state really would be a disaster for the United States in so many ways. And we've got to stop it. We have the opportunity to do it. And I'd like to see that kind of clarity reintroduced into the American position in these negotiations. So there's no doubt on any side about that.
So I think just sort of one final question, if we don't have any more from our audience. So we saw in the run up to and aftermath of the JCPOA in 2015, a lot of opposition from America's Arab partners toward the deal that was struck, including for a lot of the reasons that you just mentioned, including the fact that conspicuously abandoned our own gold standard for these types of agreements. To editorialize, it seems like maybe this time around, we've seen some press coverage on this, that even the prospect of, as we mentioned at the outset, something like a JCPOA 2.0 doesn't seem to be meeting with as much, at least, open hostility from our Arab partners. I'd be curious, you're more well versed in U.S. relations, especially with our Gulf partners, than almost anybody else in this town. What's your perception of how negotiations and the prospects of a new deal are being treated in the region outside of Israel, among our Arab partners, and what that might mean for other U.S. initiatives, diplomatic initiatives with our Arab partners going forward?
Well, I do believe that the Arabs are in a different place even than they were in 2015, when they originally welcomed the JCPOA, but very quickly then became quite disconcerted by it and by the concessions that had been made, and certainly let that be known privately. the Gulf states a decade forward are now, particularly our two key allies, the Saudis and Emiratis, are very, very focused on their own internal transformations, their efforts to diversify their economy, which are very aggressive and ambitious programs to attract capital and technology. And clearly the belief, which is not unfounded, that if there was another major conflict and war in the region, it would be highly destabilizing and probably undermine that long-term national transformation that they're undertaking, at least in an immediate sense. And even more than that, obviously, the sense that if the balloon of war goes up, they more than anybody else could be on the front lines of any kind of Iranian decision to try and widen the war by going after their critical infrastructure, be it in oil or other economic capabilities that they have. And that's an enormous worry because they don't have the kinds of capabilities that Israel and the United States have to defeat a large-scale Iranian barrage of missiles. If the Iranians do to Abu Dhabi what they tried to do in Israel last October with 200 missiles coming at your country, there's a good chance you burn Abu Dhabi down and you end the UAE's economic miracle. So that's a pretty daunting prospect. The only thing I'd say is that I hope this flow of American military capability into the region is somewhat reassuring to them, that we're taking their interests very much into account. General Kurilla from CENTCOM is very active in the region, moving around, I'm sure, trying to reassure countries. They see what we're doing right now in the Red Sea against the Houthis, which is an order of magnitude more punishing than anything the Biden administration was ever prepared to do against that Iranian-backed terrorist organization. And the president, of course, is coming to the region sometime in probably the middle of May, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, and I'm sure what's going to happen in Iran is going to be at the very top of his agenda. And I hope that while he tells them, I'm doing everything I can to try and achieve an acceptable diplomatic arrangement to end the Iranian nuclear weapon program, if necessary, and in a fairly short amount of time, I may have to take, together with Israel, military action to achieve that objective. And that's an objective that's not only in American interests, it's first and foremost stopping Iran from being able to have a nuclear weapon is first and foremost in the core national interests of all of our friends and allies in the Middle East, not just Israel, but all of those Sunni, moderate, pragmatic states that face Iran across the Gulf have absolutely zero interest in guaranteeing that Shiite revolutionary Iran becomes a hegemonic power across the Gulf, hiding or protecting itself with the shield of a nuclear weapon. That'll be disastrous, completely and utterly destabilizing for the region, would probably trigger a major proliferation cascade in which multiple countries across the region themselves attempt to get nuclear weapons. That won't be good in the long term for anybody's economy, anybody's stability, anybody's security in the Middle East. So while I think the United States has got a lot of work to do, both politically and militarily, to overcome what are very legitimate concerns of these frontline Arab friends of ours, I do think it's a doable task for the United States if it's clear about the end state it seeks and what it's prepared to do to achieve it, and to make sure that our friends and partners in the region are going to be taken care of and defended.
So with that, I'll tack on one final question to close out from our audience. You know, if there isn't a military campaign against Iran's nuclear program, how much of it could be destroyed? And could Iran respond like Saddam in 1981 after Israeli airstrikes took out the Osirak reactor, which is no response? And I'll just shoehorn in a shameless plug for JINSA's work here, a paper that just came out called Last Best Chance, which looks at U.S. and Israeli military considerations for dealing with Iran's nuclear program in the time that remains, and also the various scenarios and considerations for Iran's response. So I guess I'll use that to tee up just a closing thought from you, John.
Well, on the question of how much damage that can be done, nobody knows for sure. For the longest time, people said Israel could not actually seriously set back the Iranian nuclear project on its own. It was just some of the targets that were critical to the program were too deeply buried. Listen, I think over the last year, we've seen the Israelis, when they put their mind to a problem, are capable of extraordinarily creative things and having capabilities that none of us were really aware of. Anybody who had told people on September 26th of 2024 that Israel would be capable of effectively decapitating and devastating the Hezbollah terrorist organization, the A-team of global terrorists armed with 150,000 to 200,000 missiles, UAV and cruise missiles, that Israel could lay them on their backside in the course of 10 days. People would have said, you're crazy. And yet that's exactly what Israel did, and Hezbollah couldn't do anything about it. And more than that, Iran wasn't able to do anything about it. So anybody at this point in time that really shortchanges Israel, if it's determined to try and achieve something, I think is taking a real chance. Having said that, obviously, a U.S. Israeli joint project to do this would be infinitely better, because the U.S. capabilities are just of an order that no other country in the world could match. And it's my sense, given our common interest in seeing that program set back to the maximum extent possible, once Israel decides to do this, I think it's in the best interest of the United States to help Israel make sure it gets done to the maximum extent possible. Now, having said that, on the question of could Iran simply stand down and decide on not to retaliate at all, or only to undertake some kind of symbolic retaliation to save its honor and yet not start some kind of broader war, I think it's entirely possible. Again, I don't think you can bet on it as a policymaker or as the president of the United States. But if you look at what Iran's response was when Israel spent the better part of a night flying 100 jets in and around Iranian airspace, devastating every single target it went after in terms of strategic air defenses, in terms of sites associated with the nuclear weapons program, in terms of really devastating its ability to produce solid fuel missiles. And the Iranian answer to that was a lot of huffing and puffing, but more than 3 or 4 months later, we're still waiting for an Iranian response to that, what was an utter humiliation that Israel inflicted on it, not to mention enormous strategic damage to Iran's military capacity. So for a U.S. Israeli strike on Iran that devastates its nuclear program, sets it back for a significant period of time, costs the Iranians billions of dollars invested over the course of the last 20 years, up in smoke, and a message from the United States that you've lost your nuclear program, Mr. Supreme Leader. You still have a semblance of an energy economy, of an oil export capability that we haven't yet touched. You still have your political leadership intact. You still have some IRGC military conventional capabilities. You better stand down. But if you do decide to be stupid and retaliate, you've got a lot more to lose, and your entire regime could be at risk given how bad your domestic internal situation is. I think presented with that very, very stark existential choice, I think there's a very good chance, I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but a good chance that if we get any response at all, it won't be much more than a symbolic response, because again, Iran, that regime, if it wants to survive, I think it is not going to risk entering some kind of sustained military conflict with not just Israel, but the most powerful military on the face of planet Earth.
Well, with those relatively hopeful words, I'd like to thank John Hannah, as always, for his time and thoughts today. Thank you to our audience for joining. General Amador sends his regrets, and we'll be sure to have him join us on another JINSA webinar soon. Again, a reminder, everyone, please go to jinsa.org. In the top right corner, you'll see an Iran Talks status button that has plenty of the infographics you've seen here today and lots of other materials on the potential future course of these talks. We look forward to seeing you again on another webinar soon. Thank you all.